So welcome everyone. So my name is Marco Garganta. I'm with Plus Plus. And thank you for taking the moment to introduce yourself on the chat. We'll be using the chat a lot today. So make sure it's visible to you. So really briefly, just wanted to give you a couple of a little bit of a history. So we started the TechKnowCon many years ago. I want to say 2017 or so, and it was basically an idea from Jenny Blackburn, who was at the time working at Salesforce, and she pulled a couple of us together. It was Rajan from LinkedIn. I saw Danny here from Autodesk. There were some people from different companies in basically Silicon Valley tech companies. And basically her insight was that the way we think about learning and development is different than traditional learning and development, and just because we're dealing with a lot of technical folks and so on. So she said, let's create this group, which we did. And so in 2018, we launched it at LinkedIn. And then in 2019, it was another annual at Twitter. And I believe this photo is from Twitter. So this was pre-pandemic when we were actually meeting face-to-face. And we had this wonderful full day of speakers from all your peers, and it was just awesome. But then pandemic hit and we moved everything online, so we do this monthly roundtables. This is the first one of 2021, so we've been slacking a little bit over the holidays, but we actually do have full schedule for through first half of the year. And Tomomi, who you might have met through email and everything, she's been organizing that. So we're super excited to be rebooting this and having awesome talks from your peers coming up month by month. So briefly, we have some community guidelines. Essentially, think of it as, be a good citizen, be a good community member. This is a group that was started by us, for us. So we want to create a safe space. We want to respect each other's privacy. So, if you get to meet somebody, we don't share emails, things like that. If you meet somebody, feel free to, get to know each other and meet outside of the community as well. Please no solicitation. And I also wanted to just mention that there is a board behind TechKnowCon, and it's Katie, Rajan, Chris, Andrew, and myself. And we do have a website for those of you who don't know us. So it's techknowcon.io. These are the board members. And I think we need to update Katie. She's no longer with Twitter, but that's how we met. I used to work there once upon a time. So that's a little bit about just the people behind the scenes. I also wanted to mention that Tomomi is now managing a lot of behind the scenes and doing all the heavyweight lifting. So just heads up on that. So with that, community happens here in the round table. So we are trying to do this on a monthly basis or roughly thereabouts. But I also wanted to mention that we have a reasonably active Slack community. So we'll send you this link via chat, how to join if you're not in the Slack. But it's a great place to meet peers and say hello and get connected and ask questions or look for job opportunities, things of that nature, find out about events, etc. Twitter account is less active. We also have a LinkedIn group that is not well known, but we are trying to revive it. And there's also a website. So many ways to kind of get to engage. With that, I wanted to get quickly into what our agenda is. So far I was talking about a little bit about the history of the organization, the people behind it, why we do it, who does what, etc. But the main star for today is Ron Lichty. So Ron is going to be speaking on developing software leaders. Right after Ron's talk, we will do a breakout sessions. So we've done this before. It was very popular. So we'll basically randomly put you into smaller groups, and you'll get to reflect on talks. And after that, we'll bring you back so that you can ask questions from Ron, and then we'll do a group reflection and closing. So that's roughly the flight path. How to participate is please keep yourself muted. We found that that's the easiest, but do engage via chat, Zoom chat, and just send it to everyone. I'll be watching this chat later on when we do ask questions. We also ask questions through chat. I'll be watching it, so Ron doesn't have to keep an eye on that, and then we'll bring those questions to him. So please engage via the chat channel. If you have any issues, any technical concerns, ping Tomomi privately via Zoom as well. So with that, I wanted to introduce Ron. So I met Ron many years ago. I want to say it's been probably a decade, and it kind of escapes me. I forget exactly how we met, but it was sort of in the realm of, hey, I wanted to become a better software engineering manager, and Ron had a ton of experience at some really big companies like Apple, for example, doing that. And then at the time, Ron was considering both teaching this and also bottling all his wisdom into a book, which subsequently he did write and publish. It's called Managing the Unmanageable, and it's specific to how to basically work and manage people that make software, so software engineers. And so we're going to be talking about that topic. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and introduce Ron to come to stage.
Terrific. Welcome. So let me bring up a couple of slides myself. So before doing that, I'll note that I'm Ron Lichty. And my passion is making software development hum. And let me bring up a slide set that I want to share with you. There we go. Can we see that? Great. So I got into tech as a programmer. I spent 7 years as a programmer. I was a pretty good programmer. I've been awarded a few patents. Some software that I wrote appeared on the cover of a couple of magazines. And I spent 7 years, but I was, toward the end of that 7 years, became curious about and interested in managing. I was in a two-person consulting company, and managing doesn't go with two-person consulting companies. But I got an offer to go to Apple Computer, as it was known then, to manage, and I took that offer. And I began managing software people and teams with that, and managed them through all of these companies. You can follow the spiral there of the companies that I went to. So I managed at Apple and Fujitsu and Schwab and Stanford, which are fairly large organizations, and some very tiny organizations like Forensic Logic and Social Text and a couple of others. And 9 years ago, well, so I also, about 11 years ago, began training teams in Agile, and specifically in Scrum and Kanban, and a little bit in extreme programming practices layered onto those things. And then 9 years ago, I went from being a full-time engineering manager, director, VP of engineering, to consulting in coaching engineering and business and product leaders in making their software development hum, making it more effective, in training teams and executives in making their process more effectively agile, and occasionally parachuting in as an interim VP of engineering. So I'm going to start with this comment that managing is hard, but managing programmers specifically is hard. And it's part of what led my co-author and I to as Marco put it, bottle decades of experience of managing programmers as first level managers and directors of engineering and VPs of engineering and CTOs into a book that was originally 450 pages long. It's now 500 pages long. This is the second edition that came out a year ago. And we, both of us got into software, into managing without having any experience, training, or when we went looking for books for other books on managing the people who deliver the projects, we were able to find 6 in the history of software development. There's a ton of books on project management. As I imagine all of you know, there's a ton of books on Agile. There's a ton of books on each kind of Agile. There's a ton of books on managing in general, but there's almost nothing on managing the people who deliver the projects. And that was what we set out to do. Our publisher O'Reilly went to our publisher, Addison Wesley and Pearson, and asked them if they would ask us to go into their studio and turn it into video training. So we did that. There's 10 hours of video training available either directly from Pearson and Addison Wesley or through O'Reilly at the O'Reilly's Safari Library. And I'm also the co-author of the study of product team performance, which I was debating whether to share that with you, and then realized I wanted to share at least one of the results that we've had over the years. The pandemic edition just came out about 10 days ago. And we're looking for, people tell us, we ask, characterize your team. Is it high performance or low performance or something in between? And then we ask about practices. And correlate those practices that correlate with high performance product teams. One of the things, the first edition of our book came out 9 years ago, and I've talked to a ton of engineering managers since then. And when I've got general audiences of engineering managers, I tend to take a census of the room. And I'm looking for how much training managers have had in managing. And the question I've asked is, have you had one day of training in management? And if you have, did you get one day of training in management before you became a manager? Now, some of you are in big organizations, and I'm hoping that you've got way better results than I've gotten across the board, because what I've seen is that only half of engineering managers have had a single day of training in management of any kind, not training software people, just managing, not managing software people, managing people of any kind. And less than 5% of the engineering managers I've queried have had management training prior to beginning their management. And that raises the question of, how is it that we expect programmers to have studied the art of programming for so long, and yet how little we expect managers to have studied the art of managing? And so I'm delighted to be talking to all of you, because I think you can help. So it was why Mickey and I wrote Managing the Unmanageable, and I'll come around to the learning and development stuff that I've had, and Marco shared this in the invitation to this talk. I went to Apple. My manager said, "You will go to Managers in the Law." I went to Managers in the Law, and it was, at that time, it was a half-day class. My guess is it's about a 2-day class by now, but at the time it was a half-day class. And I came back, and my jaw having dropped at what I did not know about managers in the law. And I thought, I probably don't know a ton about managing in other ways either. And so I looked through the course listings in Apple University and went off to situational leadership, which led me to realize that that most of us in engineering management have two experiences of managers, have two kinds of role models. One set of them are micromanagers. It's tell everybody what to do. It's command and control management. And I had long ago decided I was never going to be one of those. And the other one was, I had a ton of managers who were throw you in the deep end and see whether you sink or swim. And I thought, okay, so I'm not going to be a micromanager. I'll be one of those throw people in the deep end and let them sink or swim managers, because that's the two kinds there are, right? And I went off to situational leadership and came back and said, oh, there's delegation. Oh, I could support my people. Oh, and I came back to the college hire who had been actually engaged before I was, but he wasn't done with college yet. So I came on and a month later got Tom, who has just graduated from college, and I'd thrown him in the deep end. And I came back and said, Tom, I'm sorry. I'm going to do more delegation and support now. And given the sigh of relief that I heard from him, I realized that that was the right thing. So made a big difference. The other thing that's really made a big difference for me has been multiple classes that included practice in reflective listening. And you know, my wife appreciated it too. I became a much better listener in all aspects of life. It led Mickey and I to create a class in managing software people and teams, and that was what we turned into 10 hours of video training through Pearson, Addison, Wesley, and O'Reilly. We, in the second edition, actually in the video training, we added a whole segment on what it means to be a manager in the era of Agile. And that's the significant addition to the second edition of our book, is a new chapter. Chapter 10 is entirely new. While we had dealt with Agile and waterfall and different ways of project management that managers will encounter, we hadn't directly addressed the question that we got asked a ton of times after our book came out is, my team's gone Agile, what's my role? And so we tried to answer that in another 33 pages, which made it a longer book. So the question comes up is, what is a good manager, people manager, not a project manager, but a people manager, a manager of software developers? What is a good manager? And often enough, you go off and ask a technical manager that question, and they'll come back with something about technical prowess. And if instead you ask them a different question, if instead you ask them the question of, think about the best manager you ever had. What were the characteristics of that manager? That technical prowess almost never comes up. Here's a list of things that came up when I did this. One of the times I did this, and there's no technical prowess in this list of characteristics anywhere, and yet, you know, technical prowess is valuable from a standpoint of getting respect from your team. It is valuable from that standpoint. So it's not. So I don't want to say it's not important, but these are the important things as a manager to do. Now there's a rule of thumb that I came up with as I went from being a programmer to a manager to a director of engineering to a VP of engineering, that the very thing that's made you successful in your last role will get in your way in the next role. And in fact, you know, success as a software developer, it's having highly honed coding skill, it's being able to focus, it's being able to shut out the world. It's having an engineering left brain and a crafter right brain. So I'm going to note that we took the word software engineer out of our book entirely and used the words programmer and software developer because people call themselves software engineers. So the word software engineer actually was invented 25 years into programming because programming was failing so badly. And they thought, well, if we apply the word engineer, maybe it will get better. There's a Scientific American article in the 90s at the 50th anniversary saying, no, it didn't make it any better. And it's partly because it's half craft. Software development is half apprenticeship more than engineering. Success as a manager. So there's what it takes to be a software developer. Those things get in your way as a manager, because success as a manager is welcoming interruptions, not only putting a welcome mat out in front of your door, but welcoming interruptions. Focus on enabling other people, not your great gift as a programmer, delegating things to others that you know you could do better than anybody else could because you were a hell of a programmer before you became a manager. And people skills and coaching skills and empathy, that's success as a manager. And we have too few role models for these, I have to say. All of my role models had been in those two ends of things, micromanagers or throw you in the deep end. And there's dramatically more managing up and managing out as a manager than there was as a programmer. These are big changes for managers. And there's an anti-pattern that says, oh yes, you should both code and manage. And many of our organizations do this, and you know, for budgetary reasons, I think, but it's truly an anti-pattern from the standpoint that every manager I've ever seen who tries to both code and manage does at least one of those poorly, and for the most part, both of them poorly. So the first thing I want to say that's different about managing programmers is that programmers are not all alike. And so what's similar to probably managing every other person in the world is that everybody's unique, but there are some categories that we can think about. So for one thing, programming disciplines. And if you spend any time with programmers, you're going to discover that systems engineers, and I'll use the word engineer here a few times, but systems programmers, systems engineers are very different from UI and front-end programmers. And they are very different mindsets from database programmers. And then you can come up with some other categories as well. But those three really define really different groups of people and different mindsets and different ways of thinking about problems. There are, of course, generational differences. There are morning people versus night people, and then you begin managing night people and discover that as soon as they have kids, they become morning people. Actually, when they become kids, they become all 24-hour people, but eventually the kids go to bed and they become morning people. There are very significant differences in managing employees versus contractors. And given that engineering software development managers tend to manage more of our organization, more of our organizations than any other kind of managers, and that they've got more contractors than probably any other kind of managers. It's a unique challenge. Proximity, where software development managers before anyone else probably began managing people who are not co-located with them. And cowboys versus farmers. The cowboy programmers who sometimes are 10x programmers who come charging in at the last minute and save the day, versus the farmers who plant the ground and till the soil and water it and irrigate it and make it happen week after week after week after week. And managers have to learn not to inordinately reward the cowboys, because it's the farmers who create our software development programs over time more than anything else. We need a balance of reward systems so that we've got the cowboys when we need them, but we never need to call on them. And software engineers versus code crafters, where pretty much everybody's got at least some aspects of both of those. And they're very different mixes. So what are some things that software leaders are uniquely challenged by? So I'm going to say one is recruiting, and recruiting is different for software development managers, partly because we're hiring more people in the organization than anybody else is. So there may be more people in the business than there are in the programming teams, but they're scattered across marketing and sales and finance and HR and learning and development and a much broader set of categories. Whereas we're recruiting a ton of technical people. Interestingly, shortly after our book came out, Mickey and I were asked the question of, so I should say the book started out, Mickey and I had been co-mentoring each other actually for a number of years. And we had been sharing rules of thumb with each other. And so we thought maybe we should just create a book that shares the rules of thumb and nuggets of wisdom that we've been sharing with each other. And so we put 300 of those together, and then what took us 8 years to write the book was writing 9 chapters around that, that came from our own experience. When the book came out, we got interviewed. There's a cable TV channel in San Jose that at least at the time had a software development program on it, and we got interviewed. And the interviewer looked at those 300 rules of thumb and said, "Well, which is the most important?" Neither Mickey nor I had ever thought about that, and yet both of us blurted out the same answer: always be recruiting. And it's because this is where our teams come from, and we have to balance off technical skill sets and team play. And there's this notion that, oh yeah, you just go off and hire a C++ programmer or a Java programmer or a Ruby programmer. It's like, no, software. It turns out that what has become my rule of thumb for software development is that software development is a team sport. And it's become my mantra over the last 10 years. And if it's a team sport, then we have to find programmers who play well inside of teams, and we have to figure out how to interview for that. And more of us are introverts than not, and that means we have to figure out what those skill sets are that did not come naturally to us either. There's the problem for us that we're hiring people to write bits, but bits are invisible. And we have to in an interviewing session figure out how to evaluate both the quality of the code that people write and the quality of the bits that are created by that code, that result from that code. I began when I was at Apple. I was at Apple for 7 years. The last 3 years of it, I managed the Macintosh Finder team, the UI, the UX of the Macintosh, the team that develops the way the Macintosh works. And I hired for stellar C++ qualities, coding ability, but I also hired for customer empathy. And it occurred to me, and this was 25 years ago, that in just a few years, everyone would be hiring for customer empathy. And I still see way too little of it. And I see way too little of it in the code that we use and the applications that we use on a daily basis. I have my own level of frustration with software. We find ourselves coaching recruiters because we're looking, their recruiters will bring us resumes, and we're looking through those resumes to say, well, no, but why are we saying no? What are the flags that jump out at us? And we need to share those with recruiters so that they can see those flags and do a better job of winnowing down the vast number of resumes to the ones we're actually looking for. And there's a ton of reading between the lines that we as managers do in looking at resumes, and a ton that recruiters do, but they need to understand the part that we do. So software leaders are uniquely challenged by onboarding as well. So oftentimes we talk about onboarding as an HR thing, where you come in, you get your benefits, you fill out paperwork, you do a whole bunch of stuff, but there's also onboarding onto our teams. So again, software development is a team sport. That means integrating people into the teams, and it means two things. One is activities for our new hires to do so that they become part of the team, but also creating a welcoming culture in our team so that everyone welcomes the questions and the interruptions, because we're going to get them from new people. Welcomes interruptions that otherwise we would be not so welcoming toward, because we as programmers get good by shutting out the world. And so we have to, as managers, foster an unnatural behavior on our teams, which is welcoming interruptions, in order to facilitate new hires. We have to find out ways to integrate new hires into code. into team practices. And so I want to note that, and this is why I included the fact that I'm a co-author of the study of product team performance. We asked teams about onboarding practices, and in fact, and what we learned in the very first study of product team performance, what we learned was that effective onboarding correlates with high performance teams. When we then went back in the second study and asked, do you consider your onboarding practice to be a best practice? What we found was only 4% of teams claimed onboarding as a best practice. This is possibly the lowest hanging fruit for engineering managers to take up, is better onboarding practices, making their onboarding practices a best practice. What else are software leaders uniquely challenged by? Product teams are complicated. They are not just software developers. They are also testers. They're also UX designers and UI designers. There are also product managers and product owners. There are also scrum masters. There are also. So we can expand out, and those are even more complicated personalities that, while we are not generally directly managing those folks, our expectations from our management, which is delivery from those teams, directly affect all of those. Fourth, managers of programmers can't delegate. And so I didn't mention, I actually, when I went to Apple for the first time, it was to create a product management group, not an engineering group. I was hired to create and manage a team that was doing product management for development tools at Apple. And I began by doing that product management because I didn't have the team. And then I slowly hired them in. I got my college hire, Tom, and I hired Tim from Texas to come in, and I was still doing a ton of product management and delegating. As an engineering manager, if I delegate any of my engineering management work to my programmers, I'm pulling them away from the very thing I hired them for, as opposed to they're doing the same thing I am. So a sales manager is probably the super salesperson and continues to do sales. An engineering manager becomes a manager and stops doing programming, except maybe on non-critical path kinds of, and oftentimes tooling kinds of things that help their teams. And taking any of those activities and delegating them to your team is not a thing to be doing. So managing types, we manage types of programmers differently. And I mentioned the different types of programmers. We need to understand project management principles as well. And if that's pre-agile, it's pre-agile. If it's agile, we need to understand that, and we need to understand what our role is relative to software development project management in agile. And this is one, and so I coach a couple of managers, a number of directors and VPs of engineering and CTOs, and the directors, VPs of engineering, CTOs are always looking at, how do I structure my teams? How do I organize a group of people that's larger than one team into multiple teams? What's the way of doing that most effectively? And managers have literally no training in doing this. This is all practice. This is all apprenticeship. This is my coachees being very helped by somebody who's done it before, because there's no experience to doing it, and there's very little in the way of writing about it. And finally, software leaders motivate developers, and motivate them typically by understanding what the mission of our company is and connecting that mission to the very hands-on work that developers are doing in creating code. And if you look at, so this is a modification of a chart from Frederick Hertzberg. So many of you know that Frederick Hertzberg in the 1950s actually in the 1970s or 80s, he wrote an article for Harvard Business Review that is the most reprinted Harvard Business Review article ever, based on the work he did in the 1950s, which is saying, hey, it's not just motivators, it's also demotivators, or it's also this base level of stuff. And the base level of stuff are the reds, and Mickey and I modified this to be specific to programmers. But if you look at the blue ones, those are the motivators, and the one on the left there is making a difference in the world. That is more motivating to more engineers than just about anything else. And followed by learning and growing, and toys and technology, and recognition and praise, and having fun. And then the red ones are the demotivators, that if your team is being demotivated by anything, and so you got to put the word "not" in front of the caption. So not having fun is a demotivator that is almost as high as, but not quite as high as, not having respect for your supervisor. And that describes the challenge that managers are in, because they've got to have respect of their teams, and they've got to make sure that they're having fun and that they're doing these other things before they can begin to motivate them with mission. So becoming better managers has to do with training. I've talked about training, talked about books, also mentoring from your boss and your peers and your network. Was actually how we came to write this book. Mickey and I had been having breakfast on weekends for almost a decade, at the point at which we realized we'd been sharing rules of thumb and thought we'd put them together, and then thought maybe we should write about that. And it was because for almost a decade we'd been co-mentoring each other. Managers get benefit from asking other managers about the most important lessons they've made, the mistakes they've made, how they solved them, the surprises, both good and bad, the sources of strength and support. These are the things that these and the mentoring from bosses and peers and networks are things that Marco and I have talked about over the years that caused him to create Plus Plus after leading that kind of an effort at Twitter. And I would add as well, managers asking their reports and practicing reflective listening for what they want in a manager and what they wish they could change of their manager and of their teams. And then reaching out, becoming better managers by reaching out into the community for places like the Silicon Valley engineering leadership community, the San Francisco engineering leadership community. When you get to a certain level, the CTO communities that Peter Bell runs in multiple cities around the world. Managing has to do with leading by example. And I'll throw in this nugget of wisdom from Tim Swihart, who pointed out that nothing undermines your credibility more than to pounding on your team all year long to get their work done if you don't do their performance reviews on time, because all that says is that they're not important to you. And communicating. If software development is a team sport, then team sports are gated by communicating and collaboration. And it means that managers have to communicate more. Teams have to be encouraged to communicate more. Managers have to create a culture of communication at every level with everyone, up, down, within, across, and in our remote environment. Absolutely have to pay attention to communication. I think this is an important rule of thumb for all of us. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, use them in this ratio. This was first said in, the first one I found, it was said in the Greek, and a number of millennia ago. And my own rule of thumb is that software leaders cannot over-communicate. So I think it's possible maybe in sales to over-communicate, maybe in marketing to over-communicate. Software development, I don't think you can over-communicate. We talk a little bit about McGregor and McGregor's XY theory in our book, and it's important because up until the 1950s, management was thought of as what he called theory X, telling people what to do. That micromanagement thing that I had rejected early on, whereas theory Y, he posited, is that supporting your team, enabling your team, creating an environment of continuous improvement, being developmental. And these are words actually that Agile uses to describe servant leaders, to define servant leaders. And servant leadership is in fact what good engineering management strives toward. We have to learn how to handle problem employees, and this may be universal, but there's some quirks in software development that are unique to it. I had the benefit early on. So I had the benefit of being in my third company before I had truly had a problem employee. And in that third company, I had an HR coach, Marty Brownstein, who wrote the book on it, who wrote the book on handling the difficult employee. And he coached me through handling that first truly problem employee. And it was unbelievably useful to learn corrective intervention from Marty and to learn how to do it. Because Marty's contention was at the time, and it's been my experience, that there's two results that come from this. And one of them is the employee turning around, and the other one is the employee quitting and throwing up their hands and saying, I'm not willing to do that. And both of those are good outcomes from a problem employee. Software leaders need to set high standards and foster psychological safety. And I imagine all of you know that Google's Aristotle study was the thing that brought the term psychological safety front and foremost to all of us in software development. But it in fact came originally from, and many of you may know this, from Amy Edmondson. And Amy in her book set up this for these four quadrants to say it's not just psychological safety, it's psychological safety and high standards that result in learning and the learning and high performance zone. And I think that's a marvelous way of looking at those two things together. And then we have to be very careful what we reward. Jim Highsmith points out that behavior revolves around what you measure. And I had a client a few years ago who I was explaining not to use velocity as a measure of productivity, because it's an internal measure of pace that allows teams to be able to be predictive. And the second you start measuring it, the team starts manipulating it, because the team can easily make velocity go up without changing outcomes whatsoever. What gets measured gets manipulated was what that client came back to me with. They said, we have a rule of thumb for that. What gets measured gets manipulated. And so that's the question is, do we define done as coding complete, or do we define it as features that delight customers? We have to be very careful then about rewarding with cash, as Dan Pink pointed out in his book, Drive. We need to foster culture in all of these ways. We need insight into our new hires' first days. We need to talk about. We need to figure out what to talk about in one-on-ones. New managers do. We need to figure out how to get programmers to work together well. We need to create psychological safety in technical groups. We need to resolve technical disputes, which is a whole category of problems that managers find themselves in without a lot of help. I pointed out that the center section of our book is 300 Rules of Thumb and Nuggets of Wisdom, which we've continued collecting actually on our website. And I'm going to close with a few of them that are particular to managing people in technical organizations. And with that, Marco, do you want to?
Yeah, yeah. Thanks for first of all, awesome talk. Thanks, Ron. I especially loved the nuggets of wisdom in your book. That was it was literally that, nuggets of wisdom, like tweet length insights into how to manage better. So that was always inspiring to me and super easy read. So thank you for that. So as we're all back, so we have about 15 minutes or so. Feel free to type your questions in the chat, or if you want to speak it out, you can do that as well, or just kind of give me heads up, or and raise a hand, or if anybody wants to go first, or I can also call out on people. Let me see, Matt, are you there? I can't see it.
Yeah, I'm here. Yep.
Oh, cool. Do you want to just
Sure.
say the speak out?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll be quick here. Yeah, so we see as a common challenge when people are new to frontline engineering management, the idea of like how to recognize and reward some of that, that's commonly known as glue work or invisible work, and making sure that that's like a forefront thing for engineering managers who were previously IC to like how to promote and effectively manage that, where it's not like everyone's spending all the time in code reviews, tickets, onboarding, interviewing, but that stuff is measured and supported. Because I think from a diversity and inclusion standpoint, and from often females are ostracized for doing a lot of that work, and then come promotion time, they're not promoted because they're not technical enough. But anyways, long story short, like how would we recommend ramping up frontline engineering managers to respect and value, prioritize, and normalize invisible glue work? Sorry.
And so are we talking about prioritizing it among our ICs or with our managers?
But the managers, well, I would say as a managers, as a parent, or as a teacher, making sure that you have healthy behaviors and people are spending the appropriate amount of time in those areas, not just headphones on, writing lines of code, but they're supporting that team. You call it out, right? That team, essential team-based behaviors.
Yeah, and it's really important. Metrics are really important in this case, because there are people, and I tell teams this over and over again. There are people on teams who don't write that many lines of code, but you take them out of the team and the team falls apart. And we've got to look at all of the contributors to teams, because when you look at the Golden State Warriors, and so I'm really not a basketball guy, and I can't name the players, but the Steph Curry, they're not all Steph Curry, but the people who pass the ball to Steph Curry, and Steph Curry who passes it to somebody no, I can't do it, Draymond Green. All of that makes a team. That team, by working together, does that. The analogies that I use when I'm doing agile training, and I'm talking about self-organizing teams, I'm talking about, and I describe self-organizing teams as everybody on the team needs to be willing to step forward and be a leader, and we need the psychological safety so everybody can do that, feels comfortable to do that, including our intern. If we don't have an intern who can't bring something from college that they're learning into the room that's relevant and that we don't know, we probably hired the wrong intern. That intern absolutely should be contributing, as everybody else should be contributing. I'm not asking the intern to do the architecting, and I'm not asking the architect to be the product manager. It's each of us brings our own expertise into that. And so the analogy that I use is, well, if we weren't writing software, but we were an acting group, what kind of acting would we be doing? And almost everybody, every team, somebody comes up with improv. Of course, we're doing improv because everybody is contributing in improv, and everyone's listening to everyone else, so that you can do that yes and thing that we do in improv. So I gave myself an improv class for my birthday a couple of years ago, so I know the yes and thing. And if we were doing music, what kind of music would we do? Well, it would be jazz, because everybody in a jazz group leads at some point. And it's not like they're leading and nobody else is playing. Everybody's playing with it, but that person happens to be leading right now. And they have to keep listening because somebody else is going to start leading. And so you're listening to lead, but you're also listening while leading for somebody else to be able to lead and take it in a remarkable direction. And what's the role of a manager? Well, so there's the sports analogy, of Phil Jackson. So I had a management coach who put Phil Jackson's book. So for those of you who don't know it, I didn't know at the time, probably still wouldn't, but Phil Jackson was the coach of the Chicago Bulls and inherited Michael Jordan, who was the only basketball player whose name I always remember, and pretty much the only one I knew at the time. And it was Michael Jordan and other players as who Phil Jackson inherited. And he knew he had to create a team because they weren't winning. The goal in basketball is not having the best basketball player. It's having the best team. That's why the Golden State Warriors kept beating that other guy's team, the Ohio team. You can tell how bad I am. They kept beating them because they were a better team. There was a game where Steph Curry couldn't hit a single shot, and their team beat the best player in basketball. And it's about teamwork and how do you create that? Well, that was Phil Jackson's role. That was Steve Kerr's role. Steve Kerr, turned out, it occurred to me, maybe the guy played basketball. I looked him up on Wikipedia. Yeah, he did. He played for Phil Jackson in the Chicago Bulls. That's where he learned that stuff. And so it's really remarkable getting that kind of learning.
Cool. Thanks, Ron. And by the way, yeah, Ted Lasso, if you haven't seen it, that's a great series. But anyway, I'll leave that at that. So Danny had a question. Danny, did you want to just speak it up or?
Yeah, let me speak it up. So yes, I do agree that what you reward is a huge thing. I've seen really bad issues happen because of bad rewards. What reward for what behavior leads to the creation of a high performance team, in your opinion?
So, I think one of the things we want to measure, is bugs being found by our customers. I'm going to go next to that. It's sort of a category that there are actually 4 categories that the book Accelerate, and I'm seeing a bunch of nods. Nicole Forsgren's book. A wonderful book. It was one of my top reads in 2019, and I noted I had it in 2018, and I wish it was one of my top reads in 2018, but I hadn't read it yet until 2019. It's that important of a book. Those are, I think, categories. I think that there's a flip side of what not to measure, and hopefully all of us have learned not to measure lines of code. We want fewer lines of code, not more lines of code, and not to measure that. But over and over again, I see velocity getting used as a measure, and it's just a terrible thing to measure outside of the team. It's really useful inside the team to be able to forecast, to be able to predict where you're going to be on June 15th, how much of the backlog you're going to get through. I think we need to train teams to be more predictable. It's one of the things I work on with teams is training them to fit the right amount of stuff into a sprint so that when they say they're going to do this stuff in a sprint, 80% or more of the time they actually do it, because that generates this huge amount of confidence in the team. And similarly, being able to say, June 15th, here's where we're going to be in our backlog, is the next level of that predictability that's also really, really useful to teams. There's this notion, though, that we have to measure everything. And it is one of the things that I count on engineering managers to do is to say, how's your team doing? That's a gut feel that a manager needs to have for their teams. And if a manager can't do that, we need to fire the manager, not the team, because that's part of the job, is knowing how your team is doing and how people are working. And the teams expect this, by the way, around problem employees. Teams expect managers to know there's a problem on their team, even though they haven't told them. By osmosis, we need to know that there's a problem on the team and we need to take care of it because they expect us to.
And when you said be careful with cache, can you?
Yeah, so so I'm going to direct you to Dan Pink's book, Drive.
I read it, yeah.
And probably all of you read that, which basically says unexpected cash rewards are useful, but setting cash out as a carrot is a very unuseful thing to do, and gets teams focused on cash and not on the intrinsic rewards, the intrinsic joy of programming.
Thanks.
Any other questions? I know, Chris, you had some comments around collaboration and all that. Any questions around that?
No questions, just reinforcing the point that, it's a team sport, and, Microsoft certainly has a history of individual heroics and know-it-alls and all of that. And we're, in the midst of a huge transformation to being learn-it-alls and collaboration. And so I can see the power of it starting to manifest now in our own journey. And so yeah, just reinforcing the point.
Got it. Yeah, so I was in a group with Jasmine and Matt, and we were discussing also, if this being a team player is so important on teams, how do you go about measuring and rewarding that, right? Like, how do you actually make it a priority on the team to reward for that, to make sure that it's happening, to track it, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I think our performance review processes traditionally are about individuals, and we've got to make that shift. That shift is about teams. It's about teams making impact on our business and our customers. It's about teams creating customer delight, and that's a team thing. It's not an individual thing, and what we need to create then is are teams that people love to be on, that they love to do work within, that some of the words that I shared with you the words that came back when I asked what were the characteristics of your best manager. I've also asked the question, and I think it's worth doing. Ask the question of what's the best team you've been on? What were the characteristics of the best team you've been on? And never have I not had two words, trust and respect, long before psychological safety became a watchword. And so that comes up much more often now. I'll get phrases like, my teammates had my back. We were aligned around our goal. This is stuff of us as managers, of help enabling, creating the culture, fomenting that the team to come together and have that alignment, and ensuring that they're working together in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course, there's the now famous Google research paper on what makes high-performing teams high-performing, and the Project Aristotle, right? And then they also came up with that conclusion that it's psychological safety is the number one.
Yeah, and I love and they did something that Amy Edmondson did not do, which was Google said you can see. You can walk into a team and you can observe psychological safety, and you observe it. And the phrase they use, let me see if I can come up with it, is equality in conversational turn-taking. Everyone on the team speaks about the same amount of time. And you can see that. Mm-hmm. You can observe that. You can walk into a team and just watch and see, is there somebody dominating? Is there somebody silent? Or do we have equality in conversational turn-taking?
Yeah. Jasmine just had a question about, are there any other education or knowledge management related items that have had the most impact with engineering teams? Have you noticed anything there?
Jasmine, you want to say more about that? I'm not sure what that question is.
I mean, we're the TechKnowCon group, so I'm coming from like a developer education perspective. And you mentioned onboarding is a low-hanging fruit, and I know my team manages onboarding. Are there other educational or knowledge management tools or projects or things that have been really successful with engineering teams to make them more efficient?
When I was so I had this really interesting experience. I went to Schwab at the dawn of web trading. So I went to Schwab in late '96. They had brought up web trading 6 months before that. Now, if you think back to 1996, the web browsers were really primitive, and they had just HTML. They didn't have JavaScript at the time, and so there was nothing to write anything rich in. And you had a choice. You had a choice of, you could choose Microsoft and COM, or you could choose Sun and Java. And Schwab had decided that they were going to do Sun and Java. And so, and I got hired in. From outside of financial services into this group that was using Java, and that was experimenting in Java. And they'd had 2 managers already that were internal managers. And so they were like, let's get somebody from the product world. Maybe they'll figure this out, because they were $2 million into the R side of R&D, and they had no D. They had nothing that they had delivered, and the business side couldn't figure out what to deliver. And I walked in maybe at the perfect time, because the team had figured out what Java could and couldn't do at that point. For example, it could not print. So you may remember that in 1996, Java applets could not print because they were inside the sandbox and the printer was outside the sandbox. And so it couldn't print. So what's the right thing to build with this thing? And so I became a translator between the team and the business side, and we figured out something to build in a fairly short amount of time, an asset allocation tool that would look at all of your holdings at Schwab, and it would classify it into large cap and small cap and bonds and those kinds of things. And then it would give you the Schwab test to determine your risk ability, or how much risk you're willing to tolerate. And it would show you a pie chart for what you had and a pie chart for what that risk analysis was. And Schwab didn't give any advice in those days, but you could make your own decisions that, oh, gee, I'm way overloaded in what they consider to be fairly risky given my risk profile. And so we built and we built that thing in a remarkably short period of time. It was like 2.5 months. But during that 2.5 months, my management, so I was just a director of engineering then, my management said, these folks are experimenting with technologies that nobody's ever built anything in before. We were doing stuff in Java before anybody else was doing stuff in Java. We had to know about as much as the Sun engineers needed to know in order to build this stuff. And they thought, but that wasn't the only part. It also had to talk to servers, and servers had to talk through middleware to the back end. And there were security people on our team, and there were networking people on our team, and there were mainframe people on our team, because that's where the crown jewels at Schwab were held. And the VPs said, what, we're going to take all of you offsite with an OD, an organizational development team, 2 people who are going to facilitate your being a team, that teamwork thing. Software development's a team sport. And they're going to facilitate your being a team together. This is not in the forest, falling back into people's hands. It's not that stuff, walking tightropes. This is, you're doing your work, but they're facilitating the communication and the collaboration. And we got that thing done in 2.5 months and solved some problems that I'm pretty sure nobody else had solved before. And it won some awards for Schwab. It was like a first in the industry, the thing that we created. And I came back convinced that those half-day offsites with the OD folks were incredibly valuable, and I never wanted to work on another team that didn't do that. Well, guess what? I've never worked on another team that did that. But boy, was it powerful.
And thank you for that. And actually, I just remembered that I think you and I identified that we worked at Schwab at the same time for the same manager in the late 90s. So there's that connection as well. So I'm sort of aging myself here. Cool. Well, with that, I just wanted to land the plane and say thank you, Ron. Always super awesome to learn from you and from your wisdom and experience. So thank you for speaking. We are, for us by us sort of community group. We're always looking for speakers. So please email Tomomi or ping us on Slack channel one way or another. Suggest people who are doing cool things in the industry. I know one of them, one of our future speakers is here, Danny. He's going to be speaking on a similar topic from experience at Autodesk. So that's super exciting. So we'll be talking on this topic more and more. So I don't want to steal your thunder, Danny, but I know we're lining that up. So. Yeah.
So I will just add, if any of you want me to come to your company and your company is willing to buy a bunch of copies of my book, which doesn't get me much money, but it spreads the word. That's how to do it.
Yeah,
so,
I think we did that at Twitter, and it was fabulous. So
yeah, and I just did it at LinkedIn as well.
Yeah, awesome.
Thank you for connecting me, Marco.
Yeah, of course. So most of you know that we have a Slack channel. We already talked about that. And with that, thank you. It's always awesome to see the usual faces. And we'll be doing this more often now, monthly, with Tomomi leading from the back. So yeah, thank you all. Great to see you.